This episode is brought to you by our sponsors, Hero Generation and Zinnia. I didn't even recognize myself as a caregiver. It was just what I did for my family. Sound familiar? Caregiving sneaks up on you, and before you know it, you're juggling doctor's appointments, medications, and daily care while still trying to manage your own life. This is why Hero Generation exists. They provide expert guidance and real solutions and a community that gets it so you don't have to do this journey alone. Join now at herogen.co. And Zinnia supports our caregiving by creating calming, joyful video content designed specifically for those living with dementia. We would love for you to visit zinniatv.com and use the code GATHER20 for 20% off your annual subscription. Today we go behind the scenes of the film Familiar Touch. Familiar Touch is a powerful, award-winning film that reimagines aging, caregiving, and dementia through an honest, collaborative lens. In this episode, filmmaker Sarah Friedland, actress Kathleen Chalf, executive director Sean Rushforth, and resident of Villa Gardens, Jean Owen, join me for this conversation as we share what brought the story to life. Family caregivers will see their own journey reflected with dignity, creativity, and a reminder that they are not alone. Most people think aging is about ending, about closing doors, about loss, but what if it is also about beginning again? Sarah shares about her inspiration for telling this story and creating this film. We go behind the scenes of Familiar Touch. What does it mean to open your doors to a film crew? And how do we protect dignity and have creative risk? What happens when older adults shift from being passive recipients to powerful co-creators? We talk about it all. Leadership, using art, reimagining, aging, caregiving, rooted in love and dignity. This gives family caregivers also a rare gift and the chance to see their own journey reflected back to them with honesty and grace. These small moments of transition, the weighted goodbyes, the quiet strength of starting over. This conversation is what happens when we honor aging. Here is my interview with Familiar Touch. I had the privilege of attending the screening of Familiar Touch in Chicago. I'm so excited to welcome this group of wonderful people with me today, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation, to being able to share it with all of you. First, I would love to share my guests who's joining me today and have them introduce a little bit about themselves. And we will start with you, Sarah.
Nicole, thanks so much for having us. My name is Sarah Friedland. I'm the writer and director of Familiar Touch and was also sort of the co-conspirator with Sean Rushforth over at Villa Gardens and setting up a filmmaking workshop there, which we can get into more later.
Yes, looking forward to that. And we'll go to Kathleen.
Hi, I'm Kathy Chalfant, and I had the great pleasure of playing the part of Ruth in Familiar Touch and spending a month with Jean and Sean at Villa Gardens making the movie.
And Jean.
I am a resident at Villa. I've been here 8.5 years. When this opportunity came about, Sean, I didn't know, but Sean had already said no 4 times. And then Sarah kept coming back with a solution. And so and Sarah had me at hello. I was all ready for something like this. And so I loved every moment I spent with those working on the film. And it was a wonderful group of people. The actors and the crew were clearly well chosen by Sarah to accomplish her mission, which was to put us in a good light. And she did that. And I'm excited about seeing the film in the world.
Me too. And Sean?
Well, first, I want to say one important thing to note is that Jean, at the time of the filming, was the president of our resident association. and is a natural leader in our community still. And I'm Sean Rushforth. I'm the executive director of Villa Gardens. I've been here about 2.5 years, and so I get the fun job.
You do. Yes. Well, I am excited to share how this all came together, which I think is just a meaningful introduction on how this came to be. And for our listeners who haven't seen Familiar Touch yet, Sarah, can you share with us the heart of the story, kind of set the stage, and not just what it's about, but why the story needed to be told?
Familiar Touch is a coming of old age film, and it follows Ruth, who's an 80-something woman in her transition into a care facility. But it's really a close character study of her relationship with herself and her desire and her memory and her caregivers, both familial and professional care workers. I mean, there's so many reasons why this story needed to be told. I think one is that so many of our narratives around older adults are sort of dramas of decline, that they're largely about the sort of core of the story is about older people slipping away or no longer being themselves. And I find those narratives to be often quite infantilizing and don't really show agency on the part of older adults. And what I found when I was working as a caregiver myself was that my older clients, what was stronger than what was being lost or what was shifting was the sort of continuity of who they were,
Mhm.
and the parts of themselves that persisted. And so I wanted to craft a character study sort of through the coming of age genre where we can see somebody transitioning, going through transformation, and still the core of who they are remains the same. Even as there are struggles in life that happen at any age. But then also I think care work, particularly the people whose jobs and lives are dedicated to caring for older adults and with people with disabilities. I think that work is often invisibilized in our cinema. It's relegated to the background. And I think it's the most important work there is. Care work is the work that makes all other work and life possible. And so, as much as the film is really rooted in a character study of Ruth, I also wanted it to honor the relationships between caregivers and older adults and really show the nuance and skill of care workers' jobs.
It does that. It does such a beautiful job of that. Most leaders would have seen, oh gosh, this is such a risk to open our doors to a film crew. What was the deeper why of what made you say yes? And I know you made Sarah work for that opportunity.
I did, and she was a great partner. And I think that is the key there. It was the partnership and trust with Sarah. I'd had experience with filmmaking in a community previously, not that we had made the film, but that there had been filming in our community. So I knew what that felt like, looked like, and what that could do to the community. So I had a lot of questions around that, how we would minimize the impact, continue operations, especially for the whole length of that film. And when you say the deeper why, Sarah just very articulately put the why behind the message. And that's a lot of what we bought into because it's a shared value there. And that's a story worth telling. And once we knew that we had a good partner who was going to be respectful of our residents' home and that she would be telling an authentic story here, then we wanted to be a part of it.
And you said no how many times?
I said no 4 times. Which we found out after the fact of the fourth because she had approached somebody at a previous community that I was working at back in 2017. And I didn't meet Sarah at that time. Otherwise, she probably could have talked me into it then. But the person that she approached in my community came to me and said, "Hey, there's this idea. Do we want to be a part of it?" And I said, "No, no." She said, "I think I'm going to refer it to Villa Gardens." And I was like, "Yeah, that's a great idea. Let them do it." Not realizing that years later, I would be at Villa Gardens when this would finally take place. But it was various Zoom visits of me saying, these are the logistics we would have to get over. And Sarah coming back and saying, I can do that, or we can work it out this way. And once all those pieces were in place, then I was still a little nervous. I was brand new to Villa Gardens, and this was a risky move. And to do big decisions in your first year as an executive director can be risky. And that's why I said this has to be resident driven. And I contacted Gene, who was the president, and I explained a little bit of the backstory. I said, we're going to have residents come. I told Sarah, you're going to have to win over the residents. You've won me over. But if the residents don't buy into this, then it's not going to work here. But clearly, we all bought in.
Well, Sarah had a plan that worked in terms of bringing us along and getting to know us. But Sarah, I have to, it just came to me when two words slipping away, and caregiving is not something, in my experience with my husband who had Parkinson's, was that I slipped into being a caregiver before I knew it.
Mm.
And we both had to come to the reality that that not was happening, had happened. And he had to share with me not to do certain things because it was emasculating him. And I had to realize that he'd always done the important things. And now I had some responsibility for those. And I had to do it in a positive way, not to demean him. But so being a caregiver, we all probably need a course in caregiving 1A as if we're involved in a familial way, because your children need to understand what caregiving isn't, and so do spouses or close friends. But I hadn't ever thought of that till just the slipping into is what rang a bell with me.
Really important reflection, and one that I notice often in the families that I talk with, and how they share that we see ourselves as, I'm a daughter, this is my partner, and that slipping into without the realization, but knowing that if there's that identification of what we're doing, then we can find the support and the help and acknowledge that and the big role and how important that role is, and why we need to feel empowered with information and have people that touch on these topics in filmmaking and in conversations that go, okay, yes, I'm not alone in this. And this is something that we're doing together. And for your leadership, having a CEO in Sean Kelly, that takes, right, the broader support. He spoke to that. How was that leadership played out to you that gave you more support and more influence to do the work that you're doing?
Speaking to that, so Sean Kelly, transparently speaking, he came in kind of after the film had been done.
Yeah.
But there is a Heart of Front Porch, which is the organization that Villa Gardens is a part of, that embraces this, that believes that we need to be advancing messages of aging, positive messages of aging, of community living. So the support was already here. I will admit that Sarah and I had a lot of meetings before I took it to Front Porch, because I figured, why take them something I wasn't going to do? And that was kind of where my head was. This isn't going to happen, so it's not worth. Once I realized it was happening, is I went to my leadership, to my boss, to legal, and it was really quick because it is part of the culture of Front Porch. The fact that it was resident driven, that the residents wanted to do it, is very important in our culture. And then once Sean Kelly was brought on board and he saw the film, he bought into this hook, line, and sinker. It's like, how can we help promote this? How this is so important, the work that has been done. And so we just kept running with it.
Sarah, do you remember the conversation at Grauman's Chinese when you met Sean Kelly for the first time and what he told you about the film? Share that. I have shared it, and I think it's just
We had a long conversation, so I'm not sure which.
well, just briefly, he told you that he had heard
Oh,
from
yeah.
his cohorts on the East Coast about this wonderful film that was being made, but he didn't know it was a front porch film.
Yeah, that he had heard sort of good gossip about this special film that had been made in a retirement community and didn't realize that it was one of his. And someone said, "Hey, this is yours," which is great.
Oh,
Yeah. If I could just go back for one second, I just wanted, Jean, I feel like you said something so profound that is part of the culture change that I think we need. It seemed to me part of what you're articulating is the fact that like receiving care doesn't mean you no longer have agency. Caregiving doesn't actually take away someone's agency, that someone can be cared for and have agency and dignity and autonomy at the same time. And I just, when you said that, that light bulb went off for me. So I wanted to reflect that back. And also to say, we've been talking a lot about the no's from Sean Rushforth. And while they, reveal that I'm deeply stubborn in my creative practice and persistent, I think the no's were so, so crucial. I think whenever films are made in a collaborative and communal way, there has to be a really kind of clear process of consent and consensus building for that collaborative process to work. And the no's from Sean, they weren't hard, like no, nevers. They were no's that said, here's what needs to be in place if this could work. There was sort of this opening towards the possibility of what a collaboration, like a healthy collaboration, would look like. And so he really created very kind of clear ground rules for what the community needed, both from the standpoint of it being people's homes and people's workplace, what needed to happen in order for that consensus to be built. And to me, one of the sort of most moving, looking back, one of the most moving parts of that was that typically a feature film is greenlit by financiers, whether that's a studio or an independent financing company. And in our case, our film was greenlit by residents and workers. Sean said, you're going to come to the residents council meeting and you're going to come to the staff meeting and you're going to pitch the film. And I'm very used to pitching a film to producers, funders, etc. And this was an entirely new sort of pitching forum for me as a filmmaker. And that's really where Jean Owen's leadership comes in, that, she teed it up for me in that residents council and said, this is why I think this is important. And then I think it was kind of like a congressional whip after the fact, was like going door to door being like, this is why you should vote to do this film. And I think it really creating that sort of structure for consensus to be built and for there to be consent on a communal level meant that when we walked in the doors of Villa Gardens, we knew we were doing it as partners and collaborators. And sort of the way that our crew talked about it is that we were guests in this space. And so we felt invited, and that created a culture for us to collaborate in a way that everybody was on the same page about how we would do so. So I think the no's were really generative.
Productive. Absolutely. You get to the clear and the fine tune of that. For you.
If I can pile on here for just a second, Sarah talked about the part that I played. What I heard from Sarah also leading up to this was the intentionality behind her hiring practices. That as she was hiring people into this film, that they would understand all of that background, that it wasn't going to be business as usual for how they might be used to making a film, and the whys behind that, and make sure that she was hiring people who bought into that same why.
Completely. It makes that experience. And I believe I read that you filmed, was it like 18.5 days, right? Which is, we know well, actually, no, lots of us don't. But that is a feat in and of itself to film within that amount of time, right?
It was very fast. Yeah. We had to
Mhm.
be very economical, and because we were, it was that many days, but also typically an independent film will shoot up to 12 hours. And we were thinking about shooting between 8 and 10 hours a day, just because of, wanting to be respectful of life and work at Villa Gardens. And, it's not fair to ask folks who, are not filmmakers to take their entire day up to film. So yeah, we had to be very precise.
Right. It's their home. Yeah. With your experience, not only with your grandma, and I was able to hear you share about that and working in memory care, that informed a lot of your storytelling and your filmmaking. And can you touch on that for people to have an understanding of, for you, this is personal to share that.
Yeah, I was very, very close to my paternal grandmother, Helen, who professionally was a poetry editor. And she was someone whose sense of self really was rooted in her linguistic expression. And when she developed dementia, at a certain point, she became nonverbal. My family, in their grief in processing that, we started speaking about her largely in the past tense. And at the time, I was first starting to study choreography and dance, which has been a big part of my creative practice, and became really interested in kind of embodied selves, embodied expression. And when I would visit her in the memory care wing of the assisted living facility that she spent the last few years of her life, she was incredibly present physically. She would rock, she tapped certain rhythms, she would reach out to touch you. And I couldn't articulate what I can now at the time, but that space between the person who we were speaking about as being absent and the physical sensing person who was expressed in front of me, that space really kind of stuck with me for many years. And it wasn't until I sort of trained to be a memory caregiver that I kind of understood what had happened, and how we were seeing her in her losses rather than in the parts of her that were still very expressive. And so that, yeah, that relationship with her was quite pivotal to me wanting to make this film. But in many ways, the first draft was kind of imagining her life that I did not know, because of course what I was exposed to were visiting hours. You know, I did not know the sort of minutia of her 24 hours. I really just had that little window. So much of the kind of first draft of the script was almost an exercise in empathetic imagination of like, what are all of the hours outside of that visiting window that I'm not seeing. And of course, our collaboration with Villa Gardens kind of brought that to life, because screenwriting is very speculative. Even if you have personal experiences, you're writing something that you imagine. So while I came into filming this with a pretty precise script, the script then adapted to the rhythms of life at Villa Gardens and sort of took on that texture, both from kind of us being in residence there as a crew, and then also from the feedback of the residents and staff.
Oh, it just like touched my heart when I heard that. It was the ability to meet with them before and go through some of those different courses so they could discover their gifts and how to support the film and not just be bystanders, but active participants and creators and collaborators. Tell us more about that process and how they were really represented in a beautiful way as a part of the crew in a way.
So I after working as a caregiver, I became a teaching artist and started teaching filmmaking to older adults. And one of the things I found is that filmmaking is really neglected as a subject of lifelong learning, partially because of an ageist idea that older adults can't handle technology or cameras or equipment, which I've found to be completely untrue. And so it felt like, if we're going to go make this sort of collaborative anti-ageist film, let's have a methodology that matches the ideas of the film and that acknowledges that the older adults in residence in this community are full of talent and capacious and can be put to work in making this film that is their story with us. So my number of my colleagues on the cast and the crew co-facilitated this 5 week long workshop with me, and we taught filmmaking soup to nuts. So screenwriting through editing. We met twice a week. The first session of each week was a hands-on practicum by a different member of our filmmaking team on their craft. So cinematography, acting, production design. And then the second session of each week, the residents would make a short film that they wrote and directed and did all the different crew roles. And each week they would rotate roles, so everybody basically got a taste of each of the different roles that you can have in a crew. And I think, just to go back to sort of that, like, how do you create consent in a collaborative process? What that meant is that by the end of those 5 weeks, everyone who participated in the workshop really knew the different mechanisms at play in the filmmaking process and could sign up for the part of the feature that they were interested in some cases wearing multiple hats. Like Jean was our background casting director and was also a supporting character on the cast. So some people were cast and crew, some people were just one or the other. But it meant that, people could identify where their interests and talents lay and then participate in the film in that way. And for us, it was also an opportunity during those 5 weeks, even though the workshop was specifically for the residents, at the same time, it was an opportunity for us to get to know the staff. And we're meeting with Sean and all of the sort of department heads of his crew, if you will. So getting to know the maintenance staff, getting to know housekeeping, cooking, nursing, etc., and understanding kind of their rhythms of work to create a schedule that could integrate as best as possible. Of course, there was no way to create a film schedule and setup that wouldn't disrupt or kind of have friction with life and work at all. But we were able to craft something that kind of wove in.
I'd say that because of the trust you had built when it was disruptive, and you would explain why it had to be disruptive, and we negotiated some of those things. There were times where he said, it's just not going to work. We're going to have to find another way. One of my favorite memories was when you had to take over our break room for an entire day, and you came and said, this is why we have to do it. This is why the scene is important. And how can we make this right? And you helped sponsor a lunch. It was Juneteenth, and we made it into an event. And you sponsored that as a thank you to the employees for taking over their space. So it was very collaborative.
You also got to know at least the residents that had signed up for the workshop, because you knew what you needed in terms of the script, because you'd written it. I was very impressed that that's part of what came out of the class, was learning about some of the residents and where they might help you with the film. Anyway, and in a completely nobody knew you were trying them out for the clip lady, anyway, that I was very aware of as I saw the film.
I think also the benefit of that time together, not just in sort of casting everybody's talents on cast and crew side, was also that the residents got to know, some of my key collaborators on our crew, so that, while we were filming, I wasn't the only one that people knew. You knew our DP Gabe and our production designer Steph and our first AD Andre and our costume designer Nan. Like there was a sense that we kind of we felt like we had been in residence for 5 weeks, and that you sort of knew us and we knew you, and that meant that day one wasn't our introduction. By day one, it felt like we'd been in summer camp for weeks.
Yeah. Yeah, you build that trust, right? Those relationships. Kathleen, when I was watching the film, I hung on every movement that you had and words that you were sharing. It was mesmerizing and breathtaking in a way, right? Watching that opening scene and seeing you walk through these different moments. What drew you to the role of Ruth?
While I've been listening, I realized that my relationship to the making of the film is exactly Ruth's relationship to the community, because I was the last person to join the collaboration for a bunch of complex reasons. And it was wonderful I'm not quite answering I will get back to that question, but I had the thought that I came into the community to play someone entering the community, surrounded by the community. And I'm the same age as many of the people that I was working with as a member, as a person entering this community. And it was a wonderful check on the authenticity of my work. There were people there right away to say whether or not what I was doing was accurate and felt real to the people, one of whom I was portraying. I was immediately moved by the script because my best friend, the playwright Sybil Pearson, is now in quite an advanced stage of dementia. But 2 years ago, when we made the movie, she was just about at the place that Ruth was. And she and I have known each other since 1973. Our children grew up together. We were professional collaborators. We know each other's secrets. And so I've been watching this happen to her. And so in some way, I learned how to play Ruth from Sybil, and in some way, Ruth was a tribute to Sybil. The other person that I was close to, whom I'd watched enter dementia, was my mother-in-law, my husband's mother, who was a wonderful, wonderful woman. And the first symptom that she was having serious cognitive difficulties is that she couldn't choose what to wear. And so that scene at the very beginning of the movie took me back to our time with Muzz and helping her find her clothes and what it felt like for Ruth to be alone, having to make that choice. So that I think what drew me to the script was that it seemed true to me. And then Sarah and I talked to each other and were drawn to each other in this, what I keep calling this collaboration between a new director and an old actor.
And when you're together, I could see the friendship and the care that you have for each other. You could really see that bond, and that was really special to witness. Kathleen, I believe when you had shared on a panel that being a part of the community and that environment kept you honest. What did you mean by that?
Well, Jean was there. The community of Villa Gardens is an extraordinary group of people who are there for a variety of reasons, but people who have lived astounding lives, entirely full lives. And Ruth was coming into this community as another person who was leaving one part of her life behind and embracing another. So I was surrounded by the real deal, not a bunch of sweet little old people.
Right.
As a not so sweet little old person myself, it was refreshing, and I had a wonderful time in between shots just talking to people. So it was great. It was kind of like, I don't know, what do you call it? Where one of those vacations you take in Mediterranean resorts where you meet a whole bunch of a cruise. I was on a cruise in Pasadena.
I add to that. I haven't been able to ever tell you this, Kathy, but one of my favorite memories from filming, I was leaving for the day and that you were doing something around our pool. And I mentioned that I had previous filmmaking experience, not filmmaking, but having been on sets at previous communities. And what I was used to is the leads would sit off to the side and they would come in right when the take would happen and we'd be told not to talk to them. And there you were, surrounded by all our residents, chatting and having a great time. And they said, Sean, I'm going to have to stay away from all of this. Like, Sean, come over, meet Kathy. And you were just having a good time with our residents, and you belonged, and you made our residents feel like they belonged there. And it was just such a sweet moment for me.
Oh, well, they were my contemporaries. The world, I know we had, the memories in common, the kind of thing that you have in common with your contemporaries. I'm originally from California, so we had lots of that to talk about, with lots of political discussions. It was great.
Okay.
One of the things I saw this second time, or realized how quiet her world was, because there's nothing going on at the beginning of the film auditorially. It's all in your face or your emotions or your head when you're looking in the closet. And I thought, that's her world. I hadn't thought about that. Anyway, because we don't talk to you, partly because for myself, I don't know what to say. It's like 20 years ago when friends of mine had cancer, we never talked. You wouldn't say, "How's your cancer?"
Right.
to someone. You just didn't do that. If your child died of AIDS, you didn't bring that up in conversation. As real as it was in their world, we didn't approach it. And how lonely that is, I think, and how quiet. And I wish I could live life over again. I do a lot of things I didn't do in this arena. That's part of the film, I think, is the learning, looking at a real situation and how to approach it, how to respond.
And that moving into a community like Villa Gardens and into a care situation is not a defeat, but an enhancement. As Sarah said before, it makes your life possible in the same way that any other aid does. If you can't walk, you use a wheelchair and then you get around ever so much better than just sitting in the chair, being immobile. And think that that's one of the important lessons to be taken from the movie is the way in which caregiving is an enhancement and a partnership, and therefore needs to be honored in the way that we honor our other kinds of collaborators in life, because our caregivers are, in fact, our collaborators.
Thank you for saying that. I think that's such a powerful message. And I think there's a lot of misconceptions out there that assisted living, memory care, retirement communities is about taking away independence. And it's really, like, if it's done well, Sean Kelly, the CEO of Front Porch, talks about how gone are the days of care being done to and for, and we need to change that to doing care with our residents. And it's about maximizing the independence, helping people, give them the aid where they need it so they can maintain the independence that they do have. Jean, you want to?
Well, the only thing I have learned having moved here, I have more choices in my life than I had living alone in my house. And I think often in talking about it with other seniors, they think everything's taken away. You're told what to do, you're told where to be, you're told what to see, what not to see, what to hear. And that's not true. There are many more things I do here than I would be doing if I were still in my home. When I say I have more choices to people, they kind of look at me. Some ask more information and some just move on.
If I can go back to something you were saying earlier, Jean, one of the most interesting parts of our process for me that I realize we haven't spoken about is when you're talking about the sense of sort of silence and loneliness of Ruth because of her dementia. One of the things that I think came up in our conversations during the workshop was the stigma around memory loss, even within a community of older adults.
Absolutely.
And one of the agreements that Sean and I made from the beginning is that we knew we weren't going to film within the memory care wing of Villa Gardens just because there's huge issues around consent. We wouldn't be able to do that ethically. And so we collaborated with folks that are, in sort of have different care needs between independent and assisted living within Villa Gardens. And so that meant that, some people did have mild cognitive impairment and some people didn't. And there was sort of a range of care needs and places that people were in. But I remember, Jean in particular, because Jean was casting people with me to depict who would be in the sort of memory care scenes and who would be in the assisted living scenes, because we were kind of designating two different worlds within the film, and talking to residents who didn't have cognitive impairment to cast them as folks who did, and having the conversation of how do you depict our peers, with respect and dignity, but also how they felt about kind of stepping into memory loss, even fictionally, brought up a lot of fears and anxiety and stigma. And I thought those were some of the kind of most fragile and fascinating conversations that we had in the process. That even within a community of older adults, memory loss is sort of something that is people want to keep an arm's length from, and there's loneliness in that for sure.
I've witnessed that firsthand. I was a director at a continuum of care community. And when that progression would happen, right, there would be conversation and then the community and the friendships would change. And it is such an interesting shift that happens that isn't talked about. And I think having this dialogue is so it gives us a glimpse into that and why it's important for us to have films like this and to be able to talk. And Jean, sharing how you wish that you would have had those conversations or said the things. And I think that's going to sit with us and encourage all of us to be able to do that. I thought that having the quiet, I didn't notice it until a colleague of mine or towards the end when the music came on and people need to see the film and they'll understand what we're sharing about. There, every moment sits with you and you can feel that loneliness that Jean was saying in the beginning of the film and those different scenes. And you had talked, Sarah, about, the story is told through Ruth's perspective and that you didn't want to puncture Ruth's bubble, but yet we also had an understanding and awareness of the story through her lens. Tell us more about the thought of having the film be told in that way.
So, I mean, so many films about aging are really told from the perspective of younger adults, particularly the adult children of older adults. And in doing so, that I think that's where we get into that narrative of decline, that the children are grieving the losses and the transition that their parent is going through. And as a result, it's, the older adult is depicted, as I was saying, sort of through that lens of decline or loss. And what I found when I was a caregiver was that my clients didn't perceive themselves as the protagonist of a tragedy. There was an aura of tragedy around them of how other people were looking at them, but they themselves did not perceive their stories that way. Which isn't to say there wasn't loss or sadness or grief, but that was not their kind of self narrative. And so I knew that this needed to be from Ruth's perspective, but I didn't want it to be from a sort of cognitive perspective or ocular perspective. I think that's also kind of how we get these stories about someone fading away, is that if we see someone as just truly being their cognition, as being their brain, that's where, memory loss therefore kind of invalidates who they are, and we say we're not themselves. I think so much of who we are is located in the other ways we literally make sense of the world through our senses. That we are just as much our taste, our smell, our touch, and how we interpret those things as we are our cognitive kind of rational thinking. And so I worked quite closely with my cinematographer Gabe Elder and production designer Stephanie Osen-Cohen to try and imagine how do we create frames and a visual language in which Kathy's performance can live that allow us to feel who she is and how she makes sense of the world through her senses, through her body. So we don't get to know Ruth's perspective literally through her visual perspective. There's only I think two what are known as POV shots in the film where the camera stands in for Kathy and we see what she sees. Most of the time, we're really just sort of still and quiet, observing Kathy so we can try to empathize with what she is sensing and feeling around her. And that was kind of how we crafted the sense of perspective through her, through an attunement to Kathy's body.
I'm learning things here. I love it.
Aren't we all?
What you said is very powerful from her perspective, and usually it's told from the adult child's perspective. I mean, he shows up, he's there, but we don't know him outside of Ruth's perspective. And yet I think for those who find themselves in that situation, being the adult child, watching this film can be a powerful experience as they're grappling with those difficult choices of where's the appropriate environment? How can I honor my parent? And seeing a story like this from the perspective of the resident themselves, hopefully will give them a lot of perspective on that decision making. I know that people struggle with this idea of having their loved one come to a community, and seeing the other side of that, I think, will be very helpful to many people.
When you were sharing about that, it is the growth that can happen from that, right? And the self-discovery. And you gave dignity to this role and aging and being able to have us experience that through your lens, but without airbrushing it. What do you hope that people unlearn about growing older from this film?
Let's see. It's difficult it's an interesting question to ask from this point of view. The other day, we were having a talk back after a screening of the movie, and finally, somebody in the question and answer addressed the question of sexuality, which is a big part of the movie, and nobody ever talks about it. Everybody said, well, but we were talking about it, and I said, well, as a sexually active 80-year-old, I didn't find this peculiar at all. And there was a great sort of huge reaction from the audience at the notion of sexually active 80-year-olds. And it's interesting, particularly sexually active female 80-year-olds, because at least Jean and our generation all, so grew up with Picasso fathering children at 90 or whatever, and everybody said, go for it, Pablo, whereas the reaction was not quite the same if the circumstances had been changed. So that I think that, and it's also true that now we also, Jean and I, grew up at a time when we looked at people who were 65 and they seemed awfully old. But now there's a fair chance that if you make it to 80, you'll probably make it to 100. And you're quite likely to make some of those 20 years, most of you is going to be intact. Standing up and sitting down the transitions will always be difficult. But there's 20 years of human life that we need to consider. So I hope what will happen is people seeing this movie will see not only Ruth, but the entire community as a vital, living part of human community. And as when I said before, I did a play a long time ago called Wit, and I spent a lot of time with doctors who were criticized quite a lot in the play. And I realized working with doctors that they all believed that death was a defeat, which is peculiar since it seems to be the only way, it seems to be universal, it's the only way out. But it was always seen as a defeat. And in the same way, aging is somehow seen as a defeat or loss. And for those of us who are in the middle of doing it, there are things you lose, but there are also kind of astounding areas of freedom that you discover. And I think the thing about Ruth, because she's suffering from memory loss, which is a peculiar way of putting it, but what she's really suffering from is the connection between one moment and another, so that she lives in the moment, every moment. And so it's kind of an investigation of your entire life. And that's sometimes difficult, but sometimes an extraordinary expression of what is true of life altogether. It's as though life is compressed, and you can go from 10 to 80 in 3 minutes.
I had a conversation with someone, and we were talking about growing older and the beauty that life is finite, because if it was indefinite, there wouldn't be the urgency or the action or the movement to live life in a certain way, right? It calls us to be able to be in those moments as best we
Well,
can.
it
But
also
yeah.
gives you I think the other thing about aging is you can just hang out and watch.
Mhm.
The kind of urgency of the human creature is such a busy animal. We always have anything, we have to do something or make something. And sometimes you can just see something.
Mhm.
In Chicago at the luncheon, there was someone that spoke at the end and, and said they appreciated the insertion of you cooking because that was something you had done and you knew uh, and would miss without. And I've thought about that because you were yourself when you were cooking. You were on target. You weren't vague about anything. You knew how to do what you were doing. You knew how to watch when someone needed food. You took it to them. That was, I think, as close to Ruth, the real Ruth, as any part of the film, because you were doing what you'd always done, which was to feed people and to cook and to take care. And you were just a different person. Your face was different. You were doing what you wanted and knew to do, and it was great. And the other thing that I notice up here now is that at a dining room table at a six top, uh, when I first came here, I was anxious about helping people find words or try and replace what I thought they were trying to say. The reality is, we're all there looking for words. So I just let them look. I mean, it's embarrassing when I'm with people who aren't in a process of losing words, then I'm really aware of it. But I've accepted it because it just recently is what I'm living with and learning how to do. But here we all just wait because
Right?
it'll come, or you go
And
on and then bring it up later.
Oh, thank
and
you.
I want to add something to what Jane has said, a kind of a different part of it. Again, from the point of view of the person, my best friend, Sybil, the playwright, is now nearly nonverbal and has no connection and recognizes no one but her husband, Tony, and her caregiver, but she knows that she's a writer. So there is a wall of posters from her plays in her house, and every time she walks by, she says, I wrote that. But when she watches television, she says, oh, I wrote that. I wrote that. So that the person remains. The person who is the writer, who is Sybil Pearson, for Sybil Pearson, is in there.
Yeah.
Is not in there, is right there,
Yeah.
writing the golf program.
We could talk for hours. So many good insights and messages for all of us. And Sarah, to close us on our time together, let us know where we can see the film. And I love the caregiver companion ticket component of that, if you want to touch on that quick.
Before I say where you can see the film, I just want to mention, sort of bring one last thing into our conversation, which is that Ruth is obviously a very privileged character, and that unfortunately we're living in a country where most Americans cannot access the level of care that Ruth has, and can't access the care that they might get at the quality of care they might get at Villa Gardens. And we're living in a really precarious moment in terms of our care system and infrastructure. And so I just wanted to say that I think we need to be fighting for care choices and access and saving Medicaid, because it's so crucial to long-term care and the pay of care workers in this country. So I know we have to wrap up, but wanted to inject that.
I'm going to include a link so people can contact their their representatives. Yeah.
So we're working with a wonderful distributor called Music Box Films that will be releasing Familiar Touch across the country. We open in New York City on June 20th and on June 27th in Los Angeles, Chicago, Santa Barbara, Seattle, and Detroit, with more cities to be added soon. So you can go to the Music Box Films website to check out when Familiar Touch is coming to a cinema near you. And more details about the companion ticketing will also be available on their website. We're looking to provide free tickets for older adults to bring their caregivers and caregivers to bring the older adults that they care for with them to cinemas. So we don't have all the details of that yet, but we will come June 20th. And yeah, thank you so much for bringing us together, Nicole.
Thank you all. I believe that films are bigger than us, right? It's an invitation to see aging differently, to honor caregiving, and to recognize that we carry stories that are worth telling and the importance of that. So I appreciate all of you. It was a pleasure to meet you in person, and thank you for the work that you do and the voices that you have and sharing it with all of us. I appreciate it.
You, Nicole.
Thanks, Nicole.
Thank you for listening today. If you enjoyed our episode, please subscribe and give us 5 stars. In all honesty, we'd love to hear from you. Thank you so much for listening to our episode.